They called her Moses, the story of Harriet Tubman. She was born into slavery, but she was destined for freedom. One of the people who worked with her on the Underground Railroad wrote, "A more ordinary specimen of humanity could hardly be found among the most unfortunate-looking farmhands of the South. Yet in point of courage, shrewdness, and exertions to rescue her fellow man, she was without equal. Her tales of adventure are beyond anything in fiction, and her ingenuity and generalship are extraordinary. The slaves call her Moses." She called herself Harriet Tubman, though her birth name was Araminta Ross, Minty for short. She was born in eastern Maryland, one of 9 children of African-American slaves named Ben and Harriet, better known as Rit, Ross. The parents were owned by 2 different masters. Ben was a woodsman and the foreman of a team of men cutting lumber for a white man named Anthony Thompson. Even after Thompson freed Ben Ross, Ross continued working for him for pay. Meanwhile, Ben's wife Rit and their children remained slaves of a harsh master, Edward Brodus. Brodus sold 3 of the Ross's daughters to other owners, and the family never saw them again. A few years later, Brodus arranged to sell one of the sons, but when Brodus came to take the boy, the mother, Rit, blocked the doorway of the family's ramshackle cabin and proclaimed, "First man comes into my house, I will split his head open." The sale was canceled. Perhaps her mother's defiant courage was one reason that later Minty took her mother's name, Harriet, as her own. When she was about 5, Minty's owner, Edward Brodus, began to hire the girl out for money to other slave owners. In one house, the white mistress of the home told her, "You're in charge of this baby, and if she cries, I will take the whip to you." One morning, poor Minty received 5 separate whippings. As she grew older, Minty's owner loaned her out as a field hand. "You steer the oxen while we're plowing this field." One day, a supervisor told Minty, "Go down to Mr. Campbell's store and bring back a bag of seed. He's expecting you." When Minty got there, she discovered a slave from another farm who had left his master's field without permission. Just then, the foreman of that farm appeared and told Minty, "You help me grab him so I can take him back." But Minty simply stood still in the doorway, preventing the foreman from pursuing the slave. "I'll show you," snarled the foreman, and he picked up a heavy iron weight from the store's vegetable scale and threw it to hit the runaway slave. Instead, the weight struck Minty's head, knocking her to the floor unconscious and bleeding. Onlookers brought the girl back to the farm where she'd been working. The farm owner just left her lying there, with no medical treatment, for 2 days. When the girl finally regained consciousness, he told her, "It's about time. Get back out to the field." But when she proved unable to work to his satisfaction, he sent her back to Edward Brodus. As a result of this head injury, for the rest of her life, Harriet Tubman would suffer from terrible headaches, and often she would unexpectedly drop into a deep sleep from which no amount of shaking or noise would awaken her. She said years later that she could hear everything going on around her while in these trances, and that she often saw visions, which she was certain must come from God. Raised to be religious by her parents, Minty now became more deeply so, and her beliefs and the example of her mother's courage would later give her courage in times of danger. Somewhere around 1844, records concerning slaves were often incomplete or inaccurate. She married a free black man named John Tubman. Minty Ross changed her name to Harriet Tubman. Roughly half the African Americans in Maryland were free in those days, so such a marriage was not unusual, and at first Harriet's life grew happier. But an increase in the number of her sleeping spells made it hard for Edward Brodus to hire her out for money. Brodus and his wife decided to sell her. So Harriet Tubman decided to escape. Years later, Harriet said, "I had reasoned this out in my mind. There was one of 2 things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other. Her chance came in September of 1849. By now, the Underground Railroad was operating, spiriting escaping slaves northward. A slave who knew whom to contact, or which hidden signposts to follow, could make a run towards the north. Somehow, Harriet obtained the information she needed. To the end of her life, she never revealed the routes she took or the identities of those who helped her, though we know that some were Quaker abolitionists. She said, "Quakers almost as good as colored, and you can trust them every time." She set out on an approximately 100-mile walk headed to Liberty in Pennsylvania. Traveling by night, she guided herself by the North Star. At times, sympathizers on the Underground Railroad helped her. After weeks of suspense, Harriet reached her destination. "When I found I had crossed that line into free territory, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. I felt like I was in heaven." But she soon decided that she could not enjoy her liberty while her family still lived as slaves. So Harriet Tubman decided to go back for them. Harriet became what was called a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Between 1850 and 1860, she would make 19 life-and-death trips back south. And as she famously said, "I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." She brought out relatives, friends, and total strangers. The goal of one early mission was to bring out her husband, John Tubman, but he refused to go. So Harriet changed her plan and rescued other slaves instead. And eventually, she had the great satisfaction of bringing her parents, Ben and Rit Ross, out of slavery and into freedom. Harriet's work caused the famous abolitionist writer, William Lloyd Garrison, to nickname her Moses, referring to the biblical leader who had led Hebrew slaves from bondage in Egypt. The nickname stuck. Slave owners offered a sizable reward for Harriet's capture or death, but as another Underground Railroad participant wrote, she was wholly devoid of personal fear. The idea of being captured by slave hunters or slave holders seemed never to enter her mind. On some of her missions, Harriet traveled by train. "I figured they wouldn't be looking for me out in the open like that." Still, there were close calls. On one train ride, some white passengers were talking about this Harriet Tubman. One said, "I don't know how she plans all this. They say she's totally uneducated and can't even read." Hearing this, Harriet picked up a book someone had left behind and pretended to read it so they would not suspect her identity. On another train ride, a man for whom she had worked while a slave came and sat down just a few seats away. Harriet picked up a newspaper and held it before her to hide her face until the man exited from the train. There were other dangers, too. One escaping slave grew frightened and wanted to turn back. Harriet told him, "Ain't no going back. They'd punish you till you told all you know about the Underground Railroad. Then they'd hunt down everybody that's helping folks escape." Harriet drew out a pistol. "You're going on." And he did. Among those she worked with during these years was the former slave and abolitionist leader, Frederick Douglass, whose home she apparently used for hiding runaways. Douglass later wrote, "At one time, I had 11 fugitives under my roof." Another friend, William Seward, later became Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State. In 1859, the year before Lincoln was elected president, Seward sold Harriet a house in Auburn, New York for a modest price, and she brought her parents and other relatives there to live. Between trips south, she worked at many menial jobs to raise money to support this household. When the Civil War began, Harriet offered her services to the Union. Making and selling homemade pies and root beer to pay her expenses, she nursed wounded soldiers and risked her life nursing patients with a deadly, highly infectious disease, smallpox. Harriet never caught it, which she attributed to divine protection and to herbal remedies she had learned in her earlier years. Soon, Union officers, recognizing Harriet Tubman's ability to slip in and out of the South, asked her to return there to gather information that would help them plan military campaigns. Again risking her life, Harriet gathered much of her information from local slaves who had been forced to build Confederate defenses. In 1863, having explored the area around Port Royal, South Carolina, on one of these missions, Harriet took on still another role. Firmly under Confederate control, Port Royal was providing food and other resources for Southern troops. Also, the Confederates had placed explosives beneath the surface of the nearby Combahee River, along which the Union wished to sail in order to advance into the South. Harriet contacted a Union general, saying that she could lead a raid against Port Royal. She asked to work with Colonel James Montgomery, to whom she had provided information for earlier raids. Together, Colonel Montgomery and Harriet Tubman planned a lightning-quick operation that has come to be known as the Combahee River Raid. Montgomery assembled troops on gunboats. Harriet directed them along the Combahee River. "There's explosives there and there." That day, Harriet Tubman became the first woman to share the command of an American military operation. Meanwhile, she had sent word ahead to the slaves on local plantations. She wanted to bring as many as possible to freedom, and she knew that fewer slaves meant fewer slave workers to repair the damage Colonel Montgomery's men would do that day. When the fields around Port Royal went up in flames, the slaves were ready. They dropped what they were doing and ran for the river. Harriet later said, "I never saw such a sight. You'd see a woman with a pail on her head, rice a-smoking in it just as she'd taken it from the fire. A young'un hanging on behind with a hand round her forehead to hold on, and a hold of her dress 2 or 3 more. And down her back, a bag with a pig in it. There was pigs squealing, chickens screaming, young'uns squalling. We took 'em all on board." Harriet rescued between 700 and 800 human beings that day. Colonel Montgomery's troops tore up railroad tracks, destroyed food warehouses, and removed explosives that had kept Union ships from the river. The Combahee River Raid was a total success. Harriet continued to serve till the war's end, then retired to her home in Auburn, New York, to care for her parents. Later, she converted that house into a home providing care for poor women. She spent her own last years as a resident of that sheltering home and died there in 1913 at about 91 years of age, an approximate figure because records of slave births were notoriously inaccurate. But what we can be sure of was this: the heart that gave out that day had held the courage of a lioness. And like the North Star she followed on her many journeys to freedom, Harriet Tubman herself still shines as a guiding light for those who value the liberty of the human soul. History is not only the stories of queens and kings, presidents and military leaders, famous scientists and musicians. Mostly it's about seemingly ordinary people and how they've chosen to live. The women you've been hearing about did not intend to become famous. Rather, they set out to use whatever talents they had in order to do what they thought was right, and they accomplished amazing things. There are many books and websites dedicated to sharing stories of women who strove to achieve great things in the American Civil War era and at other times and places. And, fortunately, you don't have to go following the North Star to find them. Just visit your local library or bookstore, or go online and discover these stories for yourself. For more titles from Jim Weiss and Well-Trained Mind Press, please visit us at jimweiss.com or welltrainedmind.com. Thank you for listening.